The snow came early that year, hard and sudden, like winter had lost its patience. By the middle of November, the temperature dropped below zero, and the valley woke to a cold that felt sharp enough to cut skin. Roofs vanished under white weight. Fence lines disappeared. The creek froze so fast it trapped bubbles in the ice, like held breath. Most people rushed to finish winter work, stacking wood higher, sealing doors tighter, praying they had done enough. But Thomas did not rush. Inside his strange, double-walled cabin built into the hillside, the fire was already out, and the room still felt warm. 63 degrees warmer than the world outside, without a single log burning. The first snow had fallen before the leaves were done falling. Usually, winter gave warning. Frost on windows, slow yellow trees, time to prepare. This year, the sky turned gray overnight. By dawn, snow fell heavy and wet, then froze as the wind picked up. Old men in the valley said it felt like the winter of '79, the one that killed cattle and men who thought they were ready. But Thomas did not look worried. He was outside stacking logs while the storm built behind the trees. What he was building did not look like a normal wall. The logs were set in a wide ring around his cabin, 6 feet out, maybe more. Each one was placed with care, measured, spaced evenly, like ribs around a body. It looked like a second skeleton growing around his home. Other cabins in the valley were simple log boxes with stone chimneys and patched roofs. Their owners hurried, moving with fear in their hands. Thomas moved slow, calm, like winter had not arrived for him yet. A boy from the next property rode past on a mule and watched him work. After a moment, the boy called out that his father said Thomas was building a fort. Thomas smiled just enough to be polite and said nothing. He placed another log, stepped back, and checked the spacing like a man shaping something delicate. Inside his cabin, the fire had burned out hours ago. That was on purpose. Everything Thomas did now was a test. He stepped inside and checked the thermometer by the door. It read 49. Outside, it was 16. He wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper tacked to the wall and went back out into the snow. The wind had shifted, coming hard off the ridge now, pushing flakes sideways. He pulled his collar up and kept working. The storm was early, but not unexpected. He had built for this. What mattered was not the snow. It was the air between the two walls, the still space, the silence. That was the secret, he believed. He was not building a wall. He was building a pause. The first man to laugh was his neighbor, Eli Calloway. Eli rode over in late August, long before the snow, and looked at the half-built outer ring like it was a bad joke. Eli was old, sharp-minded, and had built more cabins than most men ever would. He tapped one of the posts with his boot and asked if Thomas was building a fence or courting a tornado. Thomas said it was a shell, a second skin for heat. Eli laughed loud and rode off, shaking his head, saying Thomas would either cook himself in spring or drown when the snow melted. The laughter spread. At the general store, people called it Thomas's igloo. Someone drew a picture of a turtle with a chimney and pinned it to the wall. It was not cruel, but in a place where survival earned respect, this looked foolish. Thomas did not explain himself. He kept building. By September, the ring stood waist-high. What people could not see were the layers hidden behind the logs, birch bark pressed flat, dried moss from the marsh, old wool blankets soaked in resin and hung to dry. He was building something the wind could not understand. At night, he read by lantern light. He owned only 3 books. One was about fishing huts from far northern lands. There was a drawing of a sod house insulated by turf and silence. That drawing stayed with him. Each morning, he tested his work. Thermometers inside the cabin, inside the shell gap, and outside. 3 degrees difference, then 5, then 8. Something was happening. The idea had not come from a book. It came from a night Thomas never talked about, a night that changed how he thought about walls forever. It was the winter before. The fire had burned low while he slept. He woke to air so cold it burned his lungs. The chimney had failed, blocked by wet snow. The heat was gone. Worse, the woodpile was outside buried. He wrapped himself in a blanket and stepped into the storm barefoot, half blind with cold. He slipped twice, grabbed logs with frozen fingers, and barely made it back inside. His toes turned purple. One stayed numb for weeks. He survived, but something stayed with him, a quiet voice that said the cabin was not enough. By spring, that voice became a question. What if warmth was not about burning more wood, but about losing less heat? He sketched ideas on scrapboards, circles around his cabin. Layers, space as protection. He read old pamphlets at a dusty library, root cellars insulated with straw, thick castle walls that slowed temperature change. He did not tell anyone. When he began hauling logs to build the shell, he knew it would look strange, but fear was louder than laughter. He was not building a wall. He was building a second chance. Thomas was not a man of titles. He was quiet, good with an axe, better with silence. But this project changed how he moved. Each morning he stepped outside with purpose. He was not just surviving anymore. He was designing, even if he never used the word. His tools were simple: a hatchet, a saw he worked alone, a square carved from wood, a rusted level he barely trusted. He trusted his eyes more. He paced out a perfect ring, dug the ground level, laid stones for each log end. Upright posts went in first, packed with gravel, then crossbeams pinned with wooden pegs. At night, he sketched by lantern, inventing his own words: thermal pocket, dead space, windskin. Eli rode by again once and asked what it was now. A barn for ghosts? Thomas nodded and kept working. He was learning something most men never questioned. Heat was not just something you made, it was something you kept. Most cabins bled warmth through corners and cracks. Firewood burned fast. Time ran out. The shell was his answer. By mid-October, the structure looked strange even to him, like a wooden halo. Inside the cabin, something changed. He did not need to light the fire every morning. The warmth stayed. He wrote another note and smiled. Just once. The shell grew taller. A narrow walkway formed between the walls. He called it the buffer path, wide enough to walk through, narrow enough to trap still air. Snow piled there without melting. Frost formed only on the outer wall. He measured again. Inside, 48. Buffer zone, 29. Outside, 15. He scratched the numbers into the doorframe and stood there listening to the wind fail to find him. In town, the jokes continued. Drawings, chuckles. Thomas paid for flour and salt in silence and walked home alone. That night, the temperature dropped below zero. He did not touch the stove for 10 hours. Inside, it stayed warm. Outside, pipes cracked and animals froze. Thomas wrote the numbers down, 61 degrees of difference. He did not celebrate. He only felt relief. For the first time, winter was not winning. The wind howled that night. His cabin did not. And though no one stood with him, Thomas knew something had shifted. The proof was there, written in still air and quiet warmth. Winter had tested him, and for once, he was ready. The real test came not with cold alone, but with wind. Wind was what killed cabins in the valley. It found cracks no eye could see. It pulled heat straight out of walls and floors like a thief in the dark. Fires burned hotter, wood disappeared faster, and still the cold crept in. Everyone knew that. That was why when the wind shifted hard from the north one Sunday evening, fear moved faster than snow. The sound came first, a low hum rolling over the ridge, then a sharp whistle through the trees, and finally a roar that slammed into the valley like a wall. By nightfall, gusts tore loose shingles, toppled fence rails, and packed snow so tight it felt like sand thrown by the sky. Men stayed up late feeding stoves. Women wrapped windows in quilts. Children slept in layers of wool. The valley braced itself. Inside Thomas's cabin, the stove was barely lit, not out of pride, not out of stubbornness, but because it was not needed. He stood in the buffer path with a lantern, walking the slow circle between the walls. The wind struck the outer shell and broke apart, spilling upward and away. Inside the corridor, the air was still. Snow piled quietly but did not drift. The roof bracing held. The scene stayed tight. He checked the thermometers. Inside 41, buffer zone 21, outside 7 below and falling. He wrote it down and sat by the small fire, listening to the wind fail to reach him. He slept that night. Others did not. By morning, the valley looked wounded. A woodshed roof had collapsed at Eli Calloway's place. 2 chimneys in town had backdrafted, filling kitchens with smoke. A family west of the ridge lost an outhouse door to the wind. No one died, but everyone felt how close it came. And still, no one spoke Thomas's name out loud. Not yet. The jokes lingered, but they were thinner now. At the general store, men spoke quieter. How much wood you burned last night? Your stove hold? You lose any pipes? Someone mentioned Thomas's place, how there was no smoke from his chimney. Someone else shrugged and said maybe he just froze inside. No one laughed very hard. That night the temperature dropped again. 0 came early, clean and heavy. Water froze in buckets. Oil thickened. Even the dogs refused to sleep near outer walls. Thomas sat at his table with a cup of water left uncovered. By midnight it was still liquid. He did not smile. He only wrote the numbers down. 3 days later, the knock came. It was soft, unsure. Not the knock of a man with confidence, but of someone running out of choices. Thomas opened the door and found Jacob Calloway standing there. Snow packed into his boots, face red and cracked from cold. In his arms he held a small child wrapped tight in blankets. Behind him stood his wife Sarah, shaking. The chimney had cracked, Jacob said. Smoke filled the room. They put the fire out before it killed them. They tried neighbors. Everyone was full. The child coughed, thin and weak. Thomas did not ask questions. He stepped aside. They entered fast, driven by cold more than trust. Sarah stopped just inside the door and stared. The air was warm, not stove hot, but steady, safe. The stove was barely burning. Thomas poured hot water, handed her a cup. Her hands shook as she held it. Jacob set the child on the bed platform and stared at the walls. No smoke, no wind, just quiet warmth. They stayed the night. Then another. The child's cough eased. The fear left their eyes slowly, like frost melting in shade. Sarah began to hum while she cooked oats. Jacob helped carry wood into the buffer path, though none of it was burned. Word spread, quietly, not as a story, but as a fact. By mid-December, another knock came, then another. A widow whose stove had cracked. A man whose roof leaked cold air like a sieve. No one arrived with pride. They came with lowered eyes and cold hands. Thomas made space. He hung blankets for privacy, set up cots. The shell corridor held food and dry wood, untouched but ready. The cabin changed. It had always been warm. Now it was alive. At night, Thomas listened to breathing instead of wind. Children slept without shivering. Adults whispered in low voices, careful not to break something sacred. The fire burned more often now, not for heat, but for comfort. Flame calmed people. Thomas understood that. One evening, Eli Calloway arrived. He did not knock. He stood at the edge of the outer shell, holding an armload of split logs. He set them down carefully, straightened, and looked at Thomas. "I was wrong," Eli said. No speech, no excuses, just that. Thomas nodded. It was enough. The logs stayed. More followed. Quiet gifts left at the shell. Firewood. Food. Wool mitts sewn by hands that once laughed. Apologies without words. Thomas stacked everything neatly and said nothing. By January, copies began to appear. They were rough at first. Hay bales stacked against walls, scrap lumber nailed into windbreaks, fence posts ringed around cabins in uneven circles. Some worked better than others, but all helped. The wind lost its teeth. Fires burned slower. People slept longer. The laughter stopped. Men came to Thomas now, one at a time. They asked how wide the gap should be, where to vent, how to keep moisture from building. Thomas showed them. He drew simple diagrams on bark, used plain words, still air, layers. Slow the escape. Someone tried to pay him. He refused. This was not something to sell. The valley shifted, not loudly, not all at once, but survival has a way of teaching faster than pride can argue. February came with deep cold but less fear. Children played longer outside. Chimneys smoked less. The ringed cabins held steady. Thomas kept notes, but he stopped testing daily. The proof was everywhere now. One night, as snow fell soft and slow, Thomas sat alone by the fire. The cabin was quiet again. Most guests had returned home, stronger places waiting for them. He looked around at the walls, the shell beyond, the still air doing its work. He had built something that worked, but winter was not finished yet. And neither was the lesson it had come to teach. The cold was gathering again, heavier this time, deeper than before. And soon the valley would face its hardest night yet. The hardest cold came without warning. No storm this time. No wind howling down from the ridge, just a sudden, crushing drop in temperature that settled over the valley like a lid. The kind of cold that did not scream or rush, but pressed down slow and heavy, stealing heat by patience alone. By dusk, the thermometer outside Thomas's cabin slipped past 0, past 10 below, past 20. The sky was clear, sharp, and full of stars that looked close enough to cut. Sound disappeared. Even the creek went silent beneath its ice. The valley held its breath. In most homes, fires were fed non-stop. Wood popped and cracked from the strain. Iron stoves glowed red. Men woke every hour to keep flames alive. Women slept with boots on. Children whimpered in their dreams. This was the kind of cold that punished mistakes made months earlier. Inside Thomas's cabin, the stove burned low and steady. Not roaring, not desperate, just enough. The warmth did not rush to the ceiling or flee through the walls. It stayed. It settled. The shell did its work without asking for attention. Thomas sat at the table with a cup of water again, left uncovered. Midnight came, then 1, then 2. The water stayed liquid. He stepped into the buffer path with a lantern. Frost coated the outer wall thick and white. The inner wall was dry. The air between them was cold but calm, like a held breath that refused to move. He checked the thermometer. Inside the cabin, 38. In the buffer, 22. Outside, 25 below, 63 degrees of difference. He leaned against the inner wall and closed his eyes, not in pride, in relief. Elsewhere, the valley was breaking. A pipe burst near the river cabins. A roof sagged under ice weight and gave way. One man collapsed while chopping wood, his hands numb beyond sense. Fires went out by accident and could not be relit fast enough. People ran from house to house, looking for heat, for help, for anywhere that would hold. The knock came just before dawn, not soft this time, urgent. A fist against wood, followed by a voice calling Thomas's name. He opened the door to 3 figures bent against the cold. A man, a woman, and a teenage girl. Their faces were pale, eyes glassy. They had walked nearly 2 miles. Thomas ushered them inside. No words wasted. Blankets, water. A place near the stove. The woman cried as the warmth reached her hands. The girl curled up on the floor and slept almost instantly. They were not the last. By morning, 6 people filled the cabin. By midday, 10. Thomas managed the space quietly, calmly, the way he managed wood and air. He rationed fire not because it was scarce, but because it was unnecessary to burn more. The shell held. The warmth stayed. Someone asked how it worked. Someone else asked why no one had listened sooner. Thomas answered neither. He ladled soup. He moved blankets. He watched faces come back to life. When the cold finally loosened its grip 2 days later, the valley looked changed. Smoke hung thinner in the air. People moved slow, tired, but alive. Cabins with outer rings stood stronger. Those without showed scars. No one laughed now. Men came to Thomas openly. They shook his hand. They asked for help rebuilding. They asked him to show them again, slowly this time. Thomas did. Spring came late. Snow lingered in shaded places. But when it melted, It revealed something new. Rings of logs around cabins. Shelters built with patience instead of fear. The valley looked different. Thomas did not stay to watch the change much longer. One quiet morning, months later, he did not wake. He passed in his sleep, warm, peaceful, the way he had lived that winter. They buried him on the rise above his cabin. The shell still stood, weathered now but strong. Years passed. Other winters came. People forgot the jokes. They remembered the method. The idea spread beyond the valley, passed hand to hand, never written in books, only built into walls. No one talked much about Thomas Bridger anymore. They did not need to. Every time a fire burned low and the warmth stayed, every time wind failed to steal heat, every time winter lost its edge, his answer lived on. Not in words, but in still air. Dead ball,